your intention was never to write anything like this about UFOs
No,
at all.
no, no, no.
Can you give us a little bit of the backstory and how this all started 2012?
Yes, this is the backstory. So I'm a professor of the Christian tradition, and I look at miracles and historical events that people then interpret to be miracles in the historical record. And I write about that. And I've written about relics and, Catholic things that Protestants somewhat don't understand. And, so I've been doing this, and I'm, at the time that I began this project, I was a full professor and chair of my department. And I just finished a book on purgatory, which is the belief in, and it's an afterlife destination in Catholic and Orthodox Christianity for souls that don't quite make it to heaven, and they go to this place, this in-between place. Mm-hmm. And then once they suffer enough, then they get into heaven. So I did a book about that. And as I was doing the research for that book, I found that there were a lot of reports of aerial phenomena in the historical record. And I kept a big log of that. Every time I came across one, I thought, this is strange. And I would write it down. So I ended up with this big log of these historical events.
How far back? Historical events, what do you mean? How far back did they go?
1200. I was researching things from 1100 to 1200, just prior to Dante's Inferno and things like that, and the Divine Comedy. And, a lot of it was in medieval French. There were a lot of languages that I had to decipher. It took me a long time to do. And so I had this record of aerial phenomena. And honestly, UFOs never crossed my mind about those. I just thought that I didn't actually know what to think of them. And one of them actually made it into the Purgatory book. And it was about this nun from the 1800s in France. And this light, this orb thing would come through her cell at night. She lived in this convent. And she would go to the head of the convent, who was a priest, and she'd say that this was, it was terrifying to her. And no one believed her. This was this young nun. And she was so persistent that finally the Mother Superior said, I'll come and I'll sit with you at night and I'll see what's going on. So she did, and she saw it too. So it came in and it hovered around them and it scared them both. And they determined that it was a soul from purgatory and that it needed to be prayed back to purgatory. So the whole community then prayed that this thing would go away. All right. So it would be things like that, not just that, but things that would come through the atmosphere, like a big star. And then there would be like a face in the star, and it would have some kind of communication with people and then go back up, or, sometimes beams would come down. And so I made this list. And when I was finished with my book on purgatory and it was, at the press, I turned my attention to the next project, which was going to be a project about John England, who's a bishop, the first bishop in the Americas. He was here in the Carolinas. And I was having coffee with my friend and I showed this to him and I said, what do you think of this stuff? And he took his time, and he looked it over and he looked up at me. And the first thing he said was, Steven Spielberg. And I was like, what? And he said, this looks like UFOs. And I was mad. I was like, get it out. You are so wrong. And he said, no, Diana, it really does. It looks like UFOs.
You felt sorry to interrupt. You felt like that was devaluing your work? Is that why?
No, I just thought he was crazy. I thought it never occurred to me the parallels between aerial phenomena historically and current aerial phenomena. I mean, I'd seen, like everyone, some episodes of Ancient Aliens and such, but it never struck me to actually look into anything like this. I just thought that I honestly was not a believer.
Well, case in point, because I also learned, there's a story you recounted in another interview, that your brother encountered an orb when he was small, when he was young.
Yes.
And that became the talk of the family as well.
It did for that day. And then we somehow all promptly forgot about it. And I
Yeah.
didn't even remember it until I started to do this research.
Is that
So
interesting?
and that's another pattern,
Hmm.
which is very strange. So yes, so there was coincidentally, after I talked to my friend about my research in the aerial phenomena, there was a conference, a UFO conference here in my town, and I signed up to go. And that's where I met Chris Bledsoe, and he gave a presentation about his experience. And I also met a lot of other people who had experiences. And I realized that my friend was actually making sense, that, wow, what people had been talking about in the historical record is still happening. And is it just that they're seeing drones in the sky, and what's their interpretive framework today? And so that's how I began the research. I said, this is definitely viable to do as a project. I'll do it. I have all this data, and I'll just get some more data, and I'll do a comparative analysis of stuff from back in the day, in Europe and whatnot, to American frameworks for understanding aerial phenomena. And that's how I started my book. So I immediately met a lot of people that I thought I would never meet. I'm sorry. And they turned out to be people like Dr. Gary Nolan, who at the time, he was Dr. Gary Nolan. But for my book, we used pseudonyms because this was prior to the government's admission that they were studying this phenomenon, which happened in June of 2021. And so this was, 2015, 2016. And, we go to New Mexico with this man named Pyler, who's affiliated with so many different government agencies that is, to me, somewhat frightening. So it took me about a year and a half to actually meet him in person. So that's why the research took so long, was because I was just not comfortable with the people that I was meeting. I mean, they were fine people. They were completely okay. But my whole epistemology of life was radically shifting. My idea about my government, my idea about the reality of aerial phenomena, everything was changing. And that takes time. So it took me a while to get used to the realities, and the realities just kept getting weirder and weirder and weirder. And so I was like constantly in this state of readjusting my understanding. And, I'm a mom. I have young kids at that time, and still really. And, I was the chair of a department. I have students. So it was a pretty wild journey.
Well, I can imagine. I mean, that's another dimension that we never talk about. When I say we, I mean society doesn't typically talk about. You're responsible to a lot of people, right? You have a large
Yes.
family, so
Yeah. Yes.
and you have students, and you have a career, and you have your research, and you have a life that you've invested into. But you're also, I'm going to put words in your mouth. You're also curious about things you don't know, and that was bringing you somewhere that you didn't expect. And you weren't not going to pursue that. I mean, I didn't even need to speak to you to know that, but you get that from reading the book.
Yes. I mean, it's where the data took me. It's like, if this is it, I need to know. I mean, why would I discount it just because it doesn't fit into my reality? That's a ridiculous way to do any kind of scholarship.